Thank you. So what I hope is that we can have a conversation about these topics today, and me leading it by providing you a description of where the idea for my research came from. And thank you, Tim. My background is primarily in business law for for-profit and nonprofit entities. And with that in mind, as I've started developing my body of scholarship, I've started to focus on the role of corporations in society. So what does this mean? The topic of the conversation today, as well as my paper, is Burma just around the corner when U.S. corporations employ refugees. What does this mean? I want to provide you the background for how this idea, this concept, and these issues came across my radar. So when I was teaching in Nebraska, I was living in Lincoln, and it became very obvious to me that there was a significant number of Burmese living in Lincoln. So I started doing a little digging around about this, and there were indeed a lot of Burmese in the area, and they were refugees coming from Burma very recently, as well as since the 60s, 1960s essentially. For those of you who would like to know more about Burma, just to give us some context, essentially they're sandwiched on this map, as you can see, between China and India. And if you think about it, and I want to give you this context so that it gives you an idea of what refugees actually experience. The annual average temperature in Burma ranges from 72 to 81 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you think about these refugees landing in Nebraska and how horrifyingly cold that can be for them, that just puts a little spin on this, which will add flavor in a few moments to the whole vulnerability of this population. The state of, or the nation state of Burma is, no, it didn't die, is slightly smaller than Texas. And so you start thinking about exposure to a very much bigger nation state when they move to Lincoln, Nebraska, or any other place in the United States. They are significantly ethnically diverse. Most people are familiar with Burma because of Aung San Suu Kyi, who is associated with the National League for Democracy and was under in-house arrest from 1989 until November of 2010. Upon her release, she's been involved in uprisings to provide freedom for her fellow citizens, as well as visiting other countries like the United States. So these refugees are mixed into the Nebraskan culture because the U.S. government has essentially sent them there. This came across my radar because of the fact that when I did some more digging, the refugees that were settled into Nebraska in total in 2009 were 816. When I realized how many of those refugees were actually Burmese, it was 525 in 2009, and then 528 of 818 in 2010, it was just very shocking. And I started digging into more about the policy in the United States for how they're allocating where refugees go. Originally, it was just in a few cities or a few states like Florida, New York, California, Illinois, Texas. And they started getting overloaded, the states, because the states and the local voluntary organizations, and Tim, you're involved, I think, with some of that here in North Dakota, have provided a lot of services. They're essentially it, insofar as refugees are concerned, and then they get overtaxed. The U.S. government opted to start filling in the middle, and that's how Nebraska got involved with the Burmese. Here in North Dakota, I just pulled up some numbers to comparables for 2010. You basically had no Burmese refugees here. The highest number of refugees were 216 from Bhutan. And that was in 2010, and the total was 473 refugees, 216 from Bhutan. The next highest was from the Democratic Republic of Congo, 42 people. This is in 2010. Both places, climate very, very different from North Dakota. My discovery of this issue continued because I was also reading a fantastic book by Dr. Mary Pfeiffer called The Middle of Everywhere. And I highly recommend this book to a variety of people for a variety of reasons. She's a psychologist and a clinical adjunct professor at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. And her book basically sets forth what goes on in both the communities where the refugees are landing, particularly in Nebraska, because that's where she's centered, and from the refugee perspective, that they don't necessarily have the best circumstances going for them. So while I was finding out this information about the Burmese refugees in Lincoln, Nebraska, I was also reading this book by Mary Pfeiffer. Another book that I would recommend by her is, depending on your inclinations, Writing to Change the World. She set forth the story of what refugees go through in Nebraska and other places, one being the temperature differential, right, is one of the big issues. Excuse me. I've set forth some other things to think about here, and this is a quote to start with from Mary Pfeiffer. From the moment the refugees arrive, they are offered ideas about how to spend their time, energy, and money by a culture that is very, very different from what they have experienced. And while I like to use the Burmese refugees as an example, this is consistent from Burmese, refugees from Burma, people from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Bhutan, all of them are experiencing a culture that's very foreign to them, and that's not their primary language either, English here that we speak in the US. It's a new place, new culture, new language. I don't know of any refugee here who comes to the United States with a lot of money, so they lack money, and they have a lack of network in the communities in which they move compared to what they experienced, hopefully, back in their original country before they were under threat as a refugee. They also don't have representation in terms of whether it's law or otherwise social issues. Add to that there is a 4-month window through which they have to achieve sustainability in this new environment. They have to be able to have a job to support themselves. They have to have a living situation. They have to be functional in the English language. Whatever it takes to be sustainable, they have to achieve that in 4 months. And this is where the VOLAGs, the voluntary organizations, really become important because they hopefully find apartments and furnish it with donated furniture so that the refugees, when they arrive, actually have a place to live. Part of the reason that the voluntary organizations and this 4-month window exist and are so important is that the U.S. government, I feel like I'm juggling a lot of things here, the U.S. government has multiple administrative bodies that service this issue, and they're not coordinated under one roof. And therefore, things fall through the cracks. They, particularly the refugees themselves, but also issues fall through the cracks, and they rely heavily on allocating resources to the voluntary organizations. Due to this time frame of 4 months and all of the other concepts of new place, new culture, new language, no money, or very little money, and lack of representation and no support network, they're an extremely vulnerable resource potentially for exploitation by corporations. For these reasons in this list, we find that refugees and other immigrants fill many jobs, low pay, low skill jobs that many U.S. citizens won't take on as a job. It's this pressure that they need to be sustainable, that they essentially settle for jobs that may be unpleasant, to put it mildly. What I would like to say before I get into the nut of my argument is that there are several corporations that hire directly or hire indirectly refugees and other immigrants, legal immigrants, in humane and legal fashion. but there's a chunk of corporations that hire directly or indirectly refugees and other legal immigrants in illegal and inhumane ways, and those are the target of my analysis here. In addition, I'm removing from the equation the illegal immigrants because that opens up a whole other can of legal worms, and I just am not going there with this research. I also want to recognize that there is a body of law that covers working conditions. The labor laws, OSHA, other laws exist out there that are supposed to handle these issues. My base argument to this is they are inadequate because of these continuing issues with regards to this very vulnerable population. And I'm proposing an approach to kind of circumvent this issue. Just a little side note, there were a bunch of Karen refugees from Burma who were interviewed, and they indicated that the United States is not the most favorable place to be resettled because there are so many risks involved with this vulnerability, Australia and Canada being the ones that are most favored in terms of how well they treat their refugees. The reason the United States is so popular is because we're the fastest in accepting them. So while Australia and Canada have better setup for refugees, they take longer to approve the refugees to come to their land. Administratively setting them up, the sustainability, the assistance towards sustainability is much more integrated and helpful. And it involves the government itself in both Australia and Canada more than the United States. Of course, that comes with pluses and minuses as well, if the government's involved. Part of the vulnerability, or one of the results of the vulnerability that refugees are exposed to is that some psychologists have called this they're recruited into prejudice. And the concept of being recruited into prejudice is that they end up in a situation where, for instance, my family is good friends with somebody who came from Sudan. And in the Sudan, he was a veterinarian. He also administered a refugee camp, in charge of the largest refugee camp for Sudanese in Ethiopia. So he was a very, very experienced and talented person, and he ends up, his wife was killed because she was Catholic. He and his two daughters were brought to the United States, and he has to paint doors and wood trim on houses, and just to be able to sustain his family here. And this is something that he's very grateful for, but at the same time, it's very low skilled compared to what he was accustomed to in his homeland or Ethiopia when he was managing the refugee camp. As a result of situations like this, psychologists have found that these individuals, like this friend of our family, end up recruited into prejudice because they are channeled into these low-skilled jobs and treated a certain way by local populations, and they themselves are recruited into thinking of themselves as deserving of lower-skilled jobs, certain treatment, etc. This all feeds into the picture of this vulnerable population. When we're thinking about violations of human rights in the working environment, we usually think of vulnerable populations outside of the United States having potentially illegal, but certainly inhumane treatment inflicted upon them. I'm going to provide you a few examples to just kind of get the ball rolling here. One we may be familiar with is in Africa, chocolate. Sorry, for those of you who love chocolate. But essentially child labor used to farm the cocoa beans for the chocolate, and there's a lot of inhumane treatment, including forced labor and inflicted punishment, caging, etc., in order to bring chocolate to us at a certain price. That's why we have fair labor chocolate. And this is just an advertisement. The hidden ingredient is child slavery. So that's something we may be familiar with. Or in China, with Foxconn, the working conditions there where they're forced to work extreme hours, very low pay, and then they're housed in places they can't go out of during the daytime when they're not working, or the nighttime when they're not working. And as a result, this Foxconn was associated with Apple, and we heard about this several suicides and problems associated with how the workers are treated in China, working with iPhones. Another example was very recently in Bangladesh. Workers were caught inside a building where they were working, and they were locked in there. Fire caught hold, and 100 were injured. 100 died, and many more were injured. We other this in the United States many times. We send it overseas and say it's not our problem, but it exists actually here in the United States, and many of us are not aware of it. And that is what Mary Pfeiffer's book introduced me to, because she was focusing on Nebraska, and she explained the situation of refugees in general, but then she also indicated that there are a lot of human rights abuses that go on, particularly in meatpacking and poultry plants in Nebraska. Those issues have to do with, for example, the corporations have machines in these meatpacking plants, and they have been created for European, bigger framed people. The refugees that come in are from Burma. They may be from Latin America, they may be from Bhutan, Vietnam, and they're smaller framed people that the machinery is not tailored for, and as a result end up having injuries on the job, and some of them are fatal. Or you have the meat packing plants where there's a lot of blood on the floor because they're not kept clean. People slip, fall, severely injured, or die. These are examples. All of these go on because in those corporations that have these facilities, they can coast under the radar. One of the least enforced body of laws in the United States is the set of labor laws, as an example of where this gap exists. So I started doing some exploring outside of Nebraska to see exactly how relevant this argument is beyond the borders of Nebraska. This is when I was still at Nebraska. And currently, I just thought I would mention to you the most recent event that people have seen, I think, has to do with Walmart. And this woman here in the slide, her name is Ana Rosa Diaz, and she works for CJ Seafoods down in Louisiana. And Walmart would order their seafood from CJ Seafoods, and it's interesting. Another way of othering is a corporation hiring CJ Seafoods to provide, in this case, the shrimp or other seafood. And it's CJ Seafoods that hires Ana Rosa and people like her. If Ana Rosa is forced to work, I'm trying to remember, 24-hour days, which she was forced to work 24-hour days at the risk of having her job taken from her. She was threatened with beatings and was beaten if she didn't want to work. They are imprisoned in their homes. Basically, they're not allowed to leave after 9 o'clock at night because their living facilities are right across from the